Welcome, everyone, on Facebook Live and on YouTube to this inaugural lecture by my friend and colleague, Ben Cashore. Ben is our new Lee Ka-shing Professor in Public Management at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Well, he's the new professor, new in the sense that up until now, he hasn't yet delivered his inaugural lecture, but we are going to repair that now. An inaugural lecture is, of course, usually delivered soon after someone attains a chair. But obviously, on this occasion, the coronavirus pandemic intervened. So we are only now holding the lecture in February 2021 rather than a year earlier. But Ben has followed the dictum, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so he has used the global pandemic and the amazing events of these past months to completely recraft what he might have said otherwise in the inaugural lecture. So now, instead of what would have been his other lecture, Ben's inaugural lecture is now going to be wrapped around the challenge that the coronavirus pandemic presents to policy making and to public management. Ben is an internationally renowned scholar and academic. He comes to our school from having been previously professor in environmental governance and political science at Yale University. Ben's work is multidisciplinary. It combines insights and ideas from political science, from international relations, from law, from sociology. And his research ranges over a wide spectrum, from the public management of environmental and sustainability challenges on the one hand, through, on the other, the legitimacy of non-state market-driven governance. Indeed, in both domains, Ben is a prize-winning writer and at the very top ranks of the most cited academics in the area. Among his many contributions, Ben is also credited with creating the idea of a super wicked problem. This concept Ben now uses in a unified way in his research to look at public policy challenges as diverse as the COVID-19 pandemic and the global climate crisis. Indeed, this integrated perspective will figure centrally in what we will now hear. So I will say no more of it, but leave it to Ben to tell us himself. Now, as usual, we would like the audience to engage with the presentation. So everyone out there is encouraged to comment, ask questions in the Facebook chat box, in the YouTube chat box. I will make sure to leave time after Ben's lecture for him to address some of these very interesting queries and reactions that I'm sure will be coming in. Now, it only remains for me to welcome to the rostrum Ben Cashore to deliver his Lee Ka-shing Professor of Public Management inaugural lecture, Managing COVID-19 as a Super Wicked Problem, Lessons from and for the Climate Crisis. Ben.
Thank you, Dean Kuan. It's truly an honor to give this lecture. And while it has been a year given the historic events of the last year, I'm looking forward to thinking about what we've all gone through as a society, as citizens around the world in addressing this, in many ways, nightmare, but also a significant policy challenge. And I want to begin my lecture by first acknowledging Lee Ka-shing, whose generosity provided the endowment for this chair, and why I'm here talking to you today. I also want to thank the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, who who's interested in thinking about the careful problems of our times and linking sound research and scholarship to these problems, has created an environment of truly rigorous and innovative thinking around policy design and policy analysis. And of course, the National University of Singapore, that's created a space for this kind of environment as well, and my colleagues and the students across the entire university. I also want to thank my collaborators. As you'll see, I rarely write an articles by myself. I'm always engaging with others in my endeavors because that's where the innovation lies. And I want to thank in particular for this talk my colleagues Auld, Bernstein and Levin, with whom we created the term, as the Dean mentioned, super wicked problems. I also want to thank Singapore. I arrived in Singapore for the first time in 2004. And I said to myself, wow, if I could have designed a city, which I cannot, this would have been a city that I would have designed. It really struck me as an amazing, diverse, wonderful place that was culturally rich and academically stimulating. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. In general, and of course since that time I've engaged with a number of faculty until I came here permanently last year. But I'm also grateful to be a citizen of the planet in Singapore during this time of the pandemic because of the way in which we've been able to really be able to manage this disease in ways that are quite exemplary. So with that, I want to begin by talking about two global policy challenges that have vexed policymakers around the world. And I want to begin with the one we've known for a long time, really since the 1980s and 1990s, the global climate crisis. Every year we hear evidence that it's the hottest year on record, and such that now this has been going on for the last 20 years or so, and yet we're not yet making the kind of difference we hoped we would in addressing this important problem. In fact, this problem is so important, it has pervasive impacts, from icebergs crashing in the Arctic and Antarctic to forest fires that increase because of the climate drying from Brazil to Australia. It isn't just what's happening inside those countries, but the climate warming that's causing those fires as well. And of course, in this example, the Great Barrier Reef is declining and becoming bleached owing to the warming of the ocean. This is a complex problem that is a true catastrophe in every sense of the world. I also want to make a shout out to my wife. You see those pictures are moving for you inside the PowerPoint. That's up to, because she knew how to do that. I have no clue how it works, but I'm pretty excited that we have video in the middle of the PowerPoint, okay? So shout out to my wife for that. Now, these problems, of course, are diffuse and diverse and complicated, and they're getting worse. The United Nations now says, after convening 4,000 scientists, that we've got about 10 or 12 years left to address the catastrophic effects of global climate change. So that's one crisis that we all have an interest in addressing. And of course, we have a second crisis, the out-of-the-blue policy challenge, this COVID-19, which came out of nowhere to upend and disrupt our lives in so many ways. And of course, the effects have been devastating. We now have over 100 million infected and over 2 million deaths. At the same time, of course, we have divergent impacts. And again, I've been very fortunate to be part of Singapore, where the management, both in universities and society as a whole, has been raised as a place of exemplary management on this disease that also raises a puzzle of divergent responses and approaches to this disease that, of course, are of interest to political scientists and policy students about the ways in which governments respond to these crises. So I got a question, two questions that I want to raise. What management and policy insights emerge from climate policy for thinking about COVID-19 management? And two, what from COVID management might we think about for climate governance? So these are my questions that I want to pose today. And I want to make the point that I'm going to be engaging us in a deliberative, reflexive conversation, because the academic purpose is not simply to provide data on empirical evidence, but to have dialogues and conversations about what this data actually means for the world. And that's the purpose of my conversation with you today, to think about collectively what insights emerge for all of us to address these important challenges. And so my argument is that we have to pay careful attention to the key features of any given problem we happen to be looking at, what we call the problem structure, okay? That's my first argument. What's the problem structure? Rather than simply applying a preconceived analytical tool to a problem, we think that tool has to be derived from the features of the problem itself, okay? And then secondly, how do we develop policy and institutional recommendations that are consistent with those features of these problem structures, what we call problem solutions, okay? So that's my argument. And to do that today, I'm going to first review how we applied these questions to the climate crisis. What did we do in the climate crisis? And then I'm going to turn to lessons and insights that emerge from managing COVID-19, okay? I look forward to having a conversation with you about some arguments I'm going to make at the end about what I think emerges as important questions for policy design. So let's turn to the problem structure of climate change. So again, with my colleagues Levin, Auld, and Bernstein, we created this term super wicked problems, and I use those graphics to reinforce these cognitive frames in your mind about Superman and a play in London. Together we have super wicked problems that aren't like all other problems but are unique in their features. Now this term, super wicked, has kind of caught on in the media and in the scholarly world because people recognize, yeah, some problems like the climate crisis, and I'm going to argue like COVID, have special features, have problem structures that are different than regular problems we also care about. So what are these key features? I'm going to argue that there are 4 key features that we must always think about when designing for these super wicked problems. And the first key feature is that time is running out. And yes, again, thanks to my wife for that moving clock, okay? The time is running out. Now we know from the scientists, the actual scientists who work on the climate crisis, that a carbon dioxide emission that's released into the atmosphere has the same effect on the atmosphere anywhere it's released on the planet. And that carbon dioxide and other equivalent warming pollutants last in the atmosphere for over 350 years, which means that at some point there's a tipping point in warming and it's too late to act. So unlike some problems where we can come back to the policy process again and again, for example, questions about how to manage public health care, or in the United States case, whether to control the regulation of firearms, this one doesn't afford that luxury. At some point it's too late to act, and that provides a certain kind of incentive for us to do things immediately and quickly. The second key feature is that there's no central authority. So the world is dominated by nation states in terms of developing authoritative policies for addressing critical problems. There simply is no intergovernmental process that has the authority of a nation state when it comes to climate change. In fact, the latest Paris Accord deliberately only has voluntary commitments from countries, no mandatory requirements that they do things on the ground. And that's in part because of this diffusion of authority in states and not at the global level. So we have to design policies that are consistent with that feature to be effective. I'm going to come back to that point in my talk later, and it's a key point for thinking about the climate crisis. A global problem with no global authority, what do we do? Okay? The third key feature, and this is really important, is that those seeking to end the problem are also causing the problem. This is a battle we're having with ourselves. And this is a really important feature because unlike some issues where there's simply interest group politics, different stakeholders have different positions and we compromise and find a solution, this is a struggle internally with ourselves. Now this feature has been known quite a bit in the psychology world, dealing with individual behaviors. Whether, for example, you want to lose weight or you want to stop smoking, all of us tend to do things that are against our own interests in the long run. In fact, I have my own problems when it comes to working on a computer when I have access to the internet. How many times have any one of you said to yourselves, you know, I've got a paper to write, or I've got some work to do, or I'm going to go to bed, but before I do that, I'm going to spend 10 minutes on my phone. And an hour later, you're still surfing the web, okay? This is a battle you're having with yourselves. And so the question is, how do we think about policy responses and the policy process consistent with that feature? In psychology, there are all kinds of options. For example, my addiction to the internet was solved at one point because I used to go leave home in the office and I would go work in Starbucks, where they, at some point, way back in history, did not have access to the internet. And I was a very happy camper writing my articles and not getting distracted by my internet addiction. And one day Starbucks says, you know, if you get our Starbucks card, you can get a free refill of coffee and free internet. Well, I wanted the free coffee, but not the internet. And so I actually wrote Starbucks. And I said, I've got a question. I love your free coffee. It's wonderful. I sit there, I write articles. But I'm wondering whether you could actually perhaps ban me from your internet. Because I've got an addiction, and I need you to help me control that addiction. I kid you not, Starbucks wrote back and said to me, quote, we are on it. And I got banned from the internet, okay, on purpose to deal with this problem at hand. Now, of course, Starbucks now has free internet, and I have other devices now, but the point is, we've got to find these ways to constrain our future selves, and this is a different kind of problem. Now, the issue for super wicked problems is that this is not an individual issue. This is a collective issue. The problem is that our collective governance arrangements don't always reflect our long-term interests, but our short-term concerns. And the battle, therefore, we're having isn't just at the individual level, but how do we develop the appropriate institutions for all of us to think about our long-term planning processes, okay? The battle we're having is with ourselves. The fourth key feature, and this is really important, is that the policies discount the future irrationally, okay? So this is an important point. 4,000 climate scientists tell us we have about 10 years left to act before we can't avoid the risk of massive tipping points affecting the ecology of the world and also, of course, our social and economic structures upon which we depend. And yet, over the last 30 years, the policies we put in place have not been consistent with that scientific data, okay? So the scientific data is there, the evidence is there, the projections are there, but we're not doing things consistent with our behavior. And again, this is a long-standing finding within economics, this notion of hyperbolic discounting, for example. We find that in sociology, but it's really important here as a collective problem, a governance problem, when it comes to thinking about these crises. Okay, so these are the four key features that we developed thinking about the climate crisis. And so then, what then are the policy solutions that emerge thinking of these features, okay? Because my point is, my argument is, we gotta work backwards from the key features to think about solutions. So what we said was, if the battle is with ourselves, and we need some kind of equivalent to my Starbucks banning, what do we do? And so we turned to a literature in political science and sociology called path dependency analysis, okay? Now, that sounds kind of abstract, but actually it had very practical implications because path dependency analysis discovered that there are these critical junctures in history, specific moments in time that shifted the course of history in different directions. And we thought, you know, if you're going to explain backwards why some policy is in place owing to a critical juncture, why couldn't you think about applying this knowledge forwards? And so we thought about this idea of easy to pull levers that are hard to reverse. Easy to pull levers that are hard to reverse in the policy space. And yes, once again, thanks to my wife for that moving graphic, okay? But a ratcheting effect in the policy world. Where are these levers? Where do they exist? How do we find them became a really important part of our mission. And so the problem was, you couldn't just say, hey, here are the 8 answers for policy levers, because they're all over the place in different contexts, in different countries, in different subnational units, in different countries. There's no easy answer to find them. Instead, you need what we call diagnostic questions as a way to have conversations among experts, among practitioners, among scholars, around deliberative innovation to find these triggers rather than them happening simply accidentally. So we said the first question is, what can be done to create immediate lock-in? Where once you act in a certain way, it's hard to reverse those initiatives. And certainly most countries' constitutions are an example of immediate lock-in, because constitutions are designed to do just that, right? To create some overarching ways in which we govern ourselves that couldn't change overnight. What can be done to create immediate lock-in? My Starbucks example, banned from the internet, immediate lock-in. But then we said, that's not enough. We also want to think about what can be done to entrench support over time, so that once you pull the trigger, it becomes more and more entrenched as time goes on, okay? Wouldn't that be great to find a solution like that for super wicked problems? And then the third question was, could you design a policy in some way that over time, the populations covered would be expanded? If you could, that would address the characteristic of no central authority. Because you can start small and go big over time and diffuse globally, if you could find this kind of innovation, okay? Now, we've added a fourth question. How can the above be done consistent with the problem-solving problem at hand, okay? With the science, in this case, of the climate crisis. And we added that to make sure that whatever you did would be consistent with that, okay? So this is just a table I wanted to show you where we have the diagnostic questions, and they correspond to the features of the problem at hand, okay? The problem structure. This table is simply to show you we link design questions to the problem structure, and that's a really important point and theme of my talk, okay? But I want to give you now an example of a micro-level policy design mix that followed these questions, that diffused and had an important global effect. So I'm going to give you the example to show you what I'm talking about, one of many possibilities that we think can be uncovered and triggered to address super wicked problems. So the example is the German government's program designed to lower the price of solar panels so that they could actually compete globally with high carbon-intensive energy industries. And this was known as the German government's feed-in tariffs program. And what it did, as an easy-to-pull lever, hard to reverse, was that it actually first decided it would begin with long-term contracts with German homeowners that would give them 20-year subsidies if they agreed to put solar panels on their roofs immediately. And a 20-year contract meant that it was sticky because the new government couldn't change that without paying huge penalties. So you locked in the effect right away, and you also entrenched over time. But in addition, they had a micro-level, what we call policy setting change, where they said, we're going to pay you if your behavior is so low in carbon usage that you have excess energy. We're going to pay you at the retail rate, not the wholesale rate, when your energy leaves and goes onto the grid. And that created a super efficient behavior, but also a norm about the need to think about the carbon friendly behavior and the climate crisis. And so the result was that more and more German homeowners demanded this program. And over multiple steps, it expanded in Germany. And guess what? It changed norms about willingness to pay, about values on climate change, and it led to, many argue now, much lower prices of solar panels all around the world because of this one easy-to-pull lever in Germany. In fact, over 130 jurisdictions around the world emulate this program despite no global accord requiring them to do so, okay? This is an example, therefore, of what we're talking about when thinking about how to address super wicked problems, okay? Now, there's a picture for you of what happened in Germany as a result, but this is a phenomenon now that's diffused with no collective governance arrangement globally all over the world. Okay, that's what we did for the climate crisis, and we're now involved in thinking about where are these levers to pull and how do we find them. Let's now turn to the problem structure of COVID-19, thinking about the 4 features we derived for the climate crisis. Okay, so this is interesting. Like the climate crisis, time is also running out. In fact, we know that the more governments waited to address this pandemic, the exponential increases in costs and impacts that occurred. So there's no question that time was running out in this context, and the issue was how fast is it running out, right? What do we actually know about the science regarding just how exponential that is? In fact, it was so known that you could argue that unlike the climate crisis, where governments are still slow to respond, governments did immediately think about responding to this crisis. No central authority. Now, this is a really important part of our story because, yes, there is the World Health Organization globally, but it has no authority to tell countries what to do. There's no global governance that's meaningful in that sense. Rather, it provides a really important role as an idea generator, as a way to think about and understand the science of pandemics, but it doesn't have any governing capacity in the way we think about governments. There's no central authority. In fact, it's for that reason that we've seen so many governments and management of the disease revert back to the nation state, where there is the authority needed to address internally these challenges, okay? And so that's definitely another feature that's consistent with the climate crisis that also appears to the COVID crisis. Now, the third feature, those seeking to end the problem are also causing the problem, is absolutely true. After all, the reason why the pandemic spreads is because we as human beings love to engage with each other in the global economy and sharing cultural experiences and traveling and so on, such that we are the ones that actually, through our behavior, cause the disease to spread, and of course, we also want the disease to stop. So that fits really well also with those internal struggles we're having with ourselves, okay? Now, the fourth feature, policies discount the future rationally, is a bit kind of a mixed bag. It kind of distinguishes actually the responses of different countries. You may recall early on in the pandemic, Italy and President Trump at the time, he said, yeah, we're going to open our borders and open our economy in April. He said in April, okay? And we're now February the following year, because he was thinking about other problems. And so the COVID management one was discounted irrationally based on the nature of the epidemiology itself, okay? But we don't see this everywhere in the world. So maybe this is actually an important question for research. Why do we see this feature in some countries and not others? Okay? But overall, the point here is that problem structure and attention to it can help us think about understanding these challenges. There's also a near-term dimension to this. I'll give you an example of the phenomenon known in North America as helicopter parenting, where parents began in the 1990s to really kind of always be with their children doing everything. And this led some psychologists to do papers arguing that kids didn't have enough independence to develop their own psychological well-being. Well, helicopter parenting in the US context emerged after a handful of cases of child abduction that got a lot of attention in the media, but then got blown out of proportion so much that the intensity on that one issue led to another issue as well. And perhaps there are things we can learn from that example for COVID as well. So then, problem solutions for the COVID crisis. What can we then say? And I'm going to actually make 3 arguments about COVID management based on the climate crisis. The first is, unlike climate change, durable policy objectives, for example, saving lives, okay, durable policy objectives requires an ability to change specific requirements, okay, constantly, given the emerging epidemiology. This is really important. So in the climate crisis, we already know the science about the greenhouse gases that are causing the problem. We know the more I cycle to work instead of taking my own car, the more we reduce these emissions, the better we can be off in meeting our global concerns about the climate crisis. But we don't know yet, given the epidemiology, exactly what to do at the behavioral level. And that means we need to have the ability to maintain durable objectives, okay, saving lives, while allowing for massive changes in what we call policy settings or policy calibrations, okay, to be consistent with the durable objectives. Well, this sounds like, obvious. However, in policy studies, we tend to talk about policy durability and policy change as if it applied to the entire policy problem we're looking at. And that's not the case when it comes to COVID management. We want durability and objectives, but the ability to have constant change in the policy settings and policy calibrations, unlike the climate crisis. Okay? So then, how do we do that? How do we find ways to maintain durable objectives while allowing for massive changes in policy settings? Okay? And by the way, if we don't do this, we can run into accidental lock-ins. For example, I read an article where in Thailand, they thought initially that the disease spread much more on metal and steel material, and they installed foot pedals to run elevators in new buildings in Thailand in some cases. And that actually led to a lock-in because that's an infrastructural investment that actually could have been used elsewhere if we'd been able to think more and knew more about the disease itself at the time. So what I want to argue is that we need to think much more carefully about this word called thermostatic institutions. Okay, so my argument is that pandemic management requires that governments maintain or build thermostatic institutions for effective pandemic management. Either maintain if they haven't already, or build them if they don't, okay? That allows for then durable objectives in the face of constant changes in policy settings. So thermostatic institutions are those governance arenas capable of producing swift changes in settings in order to maintain policy objectives. And I'm going to hypothesize, this is my hypothesis, that those governments with thermostatic institutions already in place were better equipped to manage COVID-19 and also the next pandemic than those that did not have those institutions in place, okay? Now that needs more research, but I think it's probably true given our experience with the climate crisis. And what we saw so far with those countries that did manage well, relatively, this atrocious disease. Thermostatic institutions. And there's a picture of a thermostat to get that into your head. Because a thermostat, think about a thermostat in a house. What does it do? Its entire objective is to maintain the temperature in the house at a stable level that doesn't change at all, 20 degrees. But that means that depending upon the outside temperature, as it fluctuates, you either have the air conditioner or the heater go on or off, which couldn't be more different on or off. And so this is a system where change is built into a stable objective of 20 degrees Celsius. So here, for COVID-19, the equivalent to 20 degrees would be saving the most lives possible, okay? So, if thermostatic institutions are needed to either be maintained or built, where do we go? How do we think about doing this, okay? What do we do? And I want to say, first of all, we already have them. Central banks in most countries are thermostatic institutions. They're given autonomy from legislatures and parliaments, from day-to-day elections, in order to promote long-term planning around interest rates and employment that are fixed objectives that then governments adjust the monetary policies for to maintain those constant and stable objectives. So we have them already in monetary policy. The point is we need them elsewhere as well. And I want to give you another example in a different case where we actually also see another example of a thermostatic institution, okay? And that is this case of this owl, this really cute owl. And by the way, I find in my research that the cuter the animal is, the more folks want to save it, okay? And look at this cute owl. It's got these round eyes. It's very adorable. It's in this beautiful forest, okay? Well, this owl, okay, was living not just in the forest, It was living in a thermostatic institution. Okay, you didn't know it, but it was. And this thermostat said that federal managers must manage for, quote, species viability. That was the equivalent to 20 degrees Celsius in the thermostatic example, okay? Well, for years, nothing happened because the owl was doing fine. But all of a sudden, scientific evidence, just like in the climate crisis or COVID crisis, found that if they kept on logging in these forests with these really huge trees, this owl would become extinct. And so the thermostat kicked in, the heater kicked in, and the result was significant decline in logging in these forests to save that cute owl. And it was a thermostatic institution in place as well. So we see these examples, but my argument is we got to think about building them, about designing them in ways that are proactively addressing the problem structure of these problems we care so much about. So I want to have us think carefully then about not just domestic thermostatic institutions, but global ones. How do we think about developing globally important thermostats, especially given the second key feature, no central authority? What do we do for pandemic management? Now, what I want to argue is that actually doing so, developing some kind of thermostatic institution, is in everybody's interest. Even if you're purely focused on country-level internal concerns, it's still in your interest to build a global thermostatic institution. And that's because doing so has the potential to either stop or reduce the next outbreak. Okay? It has the potential to stop or reduce the next outbreak. Can you imagine if there's a global thermostat in place that had got this disease stopped before it diffused all over the world and caused so much damage? Of course we would have wanted to have that institution in place, because it would have minimized and reduced dramatically the cost of country-level efforts to address the pandemic once it spread so far. And that is an obvious requirement and an obvious potential, but the question is, how would we do it? But my lesson is, therefore, it's insufficient, therefore, to simply advocate for effective global policies. Okay, we can have debates. We've now, learned that the new president, Biden, has come back to the WHO and provided resources again and advocating lots of really important policies for the planet and has rejoined the international community in that regard. But policies themselves are not enough, because if the governing arena is unstable and it's subject to actually people leaving and going, it can't provide the kind of thermostatic properties we actually want. So I want to argue that we need to spend much more time on the design around the thermostatic properties. How do we design for stickiness of the institutions to allow for adaptive efforts to address the policy settings as the epidemiology emerges? Okay? I'm not going to give you the answers today. I'm going to say it's a collective responsibility that we all share globally about how to think about designing for stickiness, not just for policies. And again, that could help us all potentially in the future save lives. Okay? How do we gain and develop thermostats globally? So, I want to argue also for the climate crisis. This is also in everybody's long-term interest as well. And the reason is that any ability to reduce the emissions going into the climate right now will have a reduction in the cost of adaptation that countries around the world are doing to what's already a committed warming world. So it's not a question of only being able to say we can just adapt to the climate crisis, because global thermostats will also help us minimize those costs. And this is one of those rare situations where, whether we're acting only for the planet or for our own self-interest, there's still a need to bring in a thermostatic environment into global governance. Now, this does not mean, and actually nor can it mean, top-down coercion. After all, one of the key features, no central authority, means that this is really not possible to do. So I'm not arguing we need a new government at the global level. I'm arguing, though, for thinking about how do we release thermostatic-like policies and institutions that would have an effect we need to address these crises. So, for example, we could establish and assist countries in achieving their Paris Accord commitments. So even though we have a voluntary Paris Accord, we've got a strong normative commitment on the part of countries to do something meaningful to address the climate crisis. And this is catching on. From China to now Biden back in the Paris Accord, to countries all over the world, there's a strong commitment the climate crisis must be addressed. We must reduce our carbon emissions. So rhetorically, we're there. But how to do it, the easy to pull levers are hard. So why not create some kind of global mechanism that might allow countries to identify those most effective levers in their own context, or transnational levers in some way. Designing for thermostats all over the world could be a really important role of the global effort to identify and address low carbon pathways. And I would add, by the way, this is now strongly being engaging a number of public policy and political science and energy reducing scholars around how do we create these critical junctures to make meaningful and durable change is now coalescing a whole range of scholarship, not just my co-authors in the Super Wicked Problems case. So then, what are lessons from and for the climate crisis? COVID-19 has shown that global cooperation is needed more than ever before. We need global cooperation. If we had had it earlier, we would have reduced the disease's impacts. And therefore, though global cooperation isn't just important for reducing conflict and reducing trade as important, and increasing trade as important as those are, but global cooperation also gives us common purpose in addressing two of the world's most pernicious, super wicked problems. And with that, I look forward to answering your questions and engaging in a conversation.
Thank you very much, Ben. Wonderful lecture, clear, powerful ideas, showing the relevance of this thinking, this inherently quite abstract thinking, but the way in which you were able to bring it alive with the challenge of the global climate, right, the challenge of COVID-19, and concrete examples where policies have actually acted in a way consistent with the ideas that you're espousing. Yeah. I'm going to turn to the questions that have come in a minute, but if I may, perhaps be mischievous a little bit to pick up on some of these strands. The idea that we are in thinking about super wicked problems is also an idea that takes as implicit and given that the world is full of problems, right, that we're beset by challenges, that the shocks that hit us would actually do us harm, right, if we didn't try to repair them. Right. Right? Yeah. And part of the problem you lay out is that when these shocks hit us, well, in a sense, it's too late. Because it's too late to fix this. What we need to do is to build these thermostatic institutions, right, which in another language might be automatic stabilizers. Right. Right? That's what a thermostat is. Yeah. If it gets too cold, I want it to repair itself. If it gets too warm, I want it to repair itself. But this language that we're dealing with problems, the shocks that hit us are bad, right, or will do us harm, that we need to set up institutions so that the shocks don't move us too far away, right, is, however, potentially also a mindset that keeps us from enjoying the best that shocks might come to us with. So for instance, one might imagine situations where thermostatic institution is the wrong outcome. So suppose that I was hit by, suppose my economy or my world, my society was hit by a shock that I want my people to fully embrace, to leverage, because it would lead to good things. Well, having a thermostatic automatic stabilizer would actually prevent my people from doing that. Now, of course, it may be that the world really is more bad shock than good shock, in which case, you know, you're central. You need to tackle these super wicked problems. But I wonder if in your thinking, what possibility there is for allowing us, societies, to ride the good shocks, to really take advantage of circumstances when they are good circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, because one person's important problem is somebody else's not too big of a problem, right? So how do we adjudicate what problems are most important, and how do we understand the trade-offs between different problem definitions and conceptions is a really important issue for those studying economic growth and priorities or the environment. And I have noticed two things. One, in my world, those studying the environment seem to prioritize the environment as they're concerned, and likewise those studying the economy seem to prioritize the economy, right? But actually, we in the policy analysis and policy studies world, what we think is a problem definition shouldn't really matter, right? What should matter is, does our analysis, our insights help policymakers and society in achieving whatever goals they want to achieve, right? And second, are they not seeing some policy problems because of the current way in which we see the world? And I would argue that on the latter point, the answer is probably yes. So much of our short-term electoral cycles are around short-term economic concerns. The environment becomes, as you say, abstract in the future. It's difficult to get a handle on, right? And yet these things also matter when we ask people, do you care about species extinctions? Do you care about the ecology? So what I would say is, if you have those conversations, deliberative conversations, and you, as a government, society, want to address a certain problem, and you're saying, gosh, other problem definitions are getting in the way, by all means, think about thermostats. But if you're like, no, I think this is just fine, this is all going to be, that short-term orientations are the way to go, that's equally plausible too.
It could well be also that humanity is a terrible judge of what's good and bad.
Right. Well, I tell my students, you know, hey, when you're planning your life, talk to your 85-year-old self, because that person's much wiser than you are. And that person has different goals in mind. So I also often think that we can do the same for ourselves.
It's just difficult, however, to imagine ourselves in that situation. Let me give two examples. Now, when we look at photographs of smokestacks emitting, you know, pollution into the air, factories running in a non-environmentally respectful way, we look at that picture in 2021 and we say this is a terrible thing. We need to fix this. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, however, if you saw that picture, you thought, this is progress. This is how we've been able to transform the world. We no longer have back-breaking work that women and children have to do. We no longer have to put animals through this terrible thing. Instead, we have filled out that energy consumption with instead inanimate burning of coal. And that's a good thing. In the 1780s, that was considered a good thing. So, you know, our perspectives have changed, and I suppose your job, very important job, is also to just constantly remind us that we need to be constantly stepping out of the immediate situation.
Because the other, you know, I mean, to reinforce your point, the last 40 years has witnessed significant economic growth owing to policies that encourage such an approach. And hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And by any count, this is a really positive thing. They pay taxes, they can go to school and have health care because of this kind of impact, right? So really positive outcome. We've also had in the last 40 years acceleration of what's also known as the catastrophic species extinction crisis. 1 million species are right now threatened with extinction. So how do we think about these problems? I think, you know, again, far be it for me to say which one's more important, but when you talk to human beings, they almost always say, yes, those things do matter to me. Our point is, how do we handle that? Because of our short-term policy processes tend to reflect one set of priorities and not the other. The second point, though, and this is really important for the climate crisis or for the COVID, is that in the long run, they coincide.
Yeah.
The economic interest and the environment are not on opposite sides, they're in the same.
Absolutely.
So reducing the cost of adaptation, reducing the cost of the next pandemic is something I think all of us would also want to think about.
I think that, there's no way to guarantee that at any point in time, the perspective that we've got right then will be the right one forever. Indeed, the history of humanity tells us that that's actually never been the case.
Right.
Things that we thought were good turned out to be the opposite.
Right.
And the only way we can guarantee that, it seems to me, is to constantly have discourse with challenging ideas, free conversation that attempt to think outside the box.
Yeah.
I mean, the central bank example I thought was really helpful. As you know, one of the sayings about central bankers is that their job is to take away the punch bowl once the party gets going.
Right.
It's the automatic stabilizer.
Perfect. Yeah.
But of course, sometimes you do want the party to keep going.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Unless you get too much inflation.
Exactly. May I turn to some of the questions that have come in, because they're really, really interesting ones. Let me first invite you to speculate on global thermostatic institutions. The United Nations would be something that most people think about as one of these possibilities.
Yeah.
But do you see, what kind of future do you see for the global institutions that we have built, in this American century, in this era of multilateralism and internationalism?
Yeah.
And do those, to you, seem fit for purpose?
Right. And it's a really important question. I think there's a lot of frustration at the slow pace of change the United Nations has brought to these problems, despite a lot of attention on the part of scientists and also on the part of agenda raising concerns. And yet the problems continue in many places. Yeah, I think even the feature of super wicked and no central authority kind of accepts that we're never going to have an equivalent to a governmental arena globally. So instead, my argument is we're seeing lots of innovation. We're seeing innovations in ASEAN, at the EU. We're seeing regional cooperation. We're seeing all kinds of private sector engagement around these problems, all kinds of innovation where we're developing collective responses to these problems. And so my point is, let's try and think not just about these really innovative collaborations as places of dialogue, but also policy design. And so I gave the example of the German government's feed-in tariff program because it was such a clear example of how an easy-to-pull lever led to such diffuse interest in creating what was really an impactful policy tool. It didn't in any way really undermine jobs or the economy, but did lower our ecological footprints. So how can these regional processes perhaps create some diffusion, create some cooperation that can create some, not just one thermostat, but many thermostats around these problems? To me, that's the question.
I see. Okay. Excellent. And do you see that the Society of Nations are on their way to building this kind of overarching sort of mechanism that will design the right kind of institutions? Are we thinking about these things right?
I'd say ever since the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there's been general excitement after the world's governments have coalesced around problems, and the latest being the Paris Accord. And yet, we have what we call, with my colleague Bernstein, a policy creation euphoria followed by implementation depression cycle. And this leads to new innovations and new ideas. So I don't want to sound, Pollyannish in this at all. But I do want to say the more we think about creative solutions, perhaps differently, the more we abstract but then also get concrete, perhaps we can make a difference in addressing the problems that are really of the vexing kind that are most difficult for policymakers.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Now, our discussions, Ben, has been quite abstract in some ways. You've been talking about ideas. I have a question here that is going to invite you to zero in on a specific nation or institution that you think does well.
Right.
Okay, and let me set up the question. When you first started talking about the characteristics of the super wicked problems, one way to try and get around the sort of self-control side of that, the hyperbolic discounting side of that, is to just tie oneself to the mast, as it were. Yeah. I'm not going to give in to temptation. This is the right way. I'm going to tie myself to the mast. Right. But of course, you then quickly went one step away from that by saying that thermostatic institutions can achieve close to that by still giving the flexibility. And so what we're really talking about is kind of a trade-off between compromise and flexibility. You don't want the inflexibility of tying yourself to the mast. You want the flexibility of a thermostatic institution, but it's not entirely flexible either. So this is the difficult trade-off to navigate. You've thought about this and you've traveled the world, you've talked to different governments, different nations. Do you think, what examples of national policies have you encountered that seem to you to give the right trade-off between giving in to compromise, keeping flexibility, but still keeping one's eye on the prize?
There's an important question of compromise between different policy goals and objectives. And there's the question of how do we think about being able to adapt to different scientific knowledge in different country level settings. And both are important with specific examples that I think are useful to think about. I can go to, for example, if you just go north of that cute little owl to my home province of British Columbia, where actually Li Ka-shing also has investments in Vancouver. And you ask the question, well, how did they do this challenge between economic growth and conservation? And what was the global orientation? It turns out that global norms diffused into specific policy settings in that country. So abstract norms of biodiversity conservation that actually emerged from what's known as the Brundtland Commission of 1986 that asked for the governments to triple their protected areas from what was then 4% to 12%, became government policy and was enacted less than a decade later, doubling the amount of land in conservation, still maintaining a strong, viable forest sector and a tourism sector, and compromising in a way that actually did adopt and embrace these values. There, to me, if you look around the world, that norm of biodiversity conservation shows up in almost every country around the world, whether it's saving the orangutan and efforts to address that in Borneo, whether it's in the embattled sage grouse in the US South. Every country has this kind of ethic now that emerged from an abstract conversation that led to a concrete kind of practice. And those are all over that I think are really important as we think about these trade-offs.
Yeah, okay. So I've got questions that are taking us in a divergent path, so two different divergent paths. So let's try and set them up. One thing is that given what you've described, there's such remarkable consistency in the way different nations have approached this problem of biodiversity. And that everyone's come to be on the same page, as it were. There are many super wicked problems, I think, where we don't get that harmonization. We don't get that point where everybody thinks the same way. In climate change, for instance, there might well be agents that attempt to hijack one of these autonomous thermostatic institutions you would like to set up. How do we guarantee, who oversees the overseer? How do we guarantee that these institutions actually do operate autonomously?
One of the first questions that we, again, argue in our own work is that the problem at hand has to be clearly specified. And then that can be the anchor through which we analyze different policy options. But oftentimes we leave that problem abstract. And we don't say, for example, whether we want the climate to reach 3 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that might sound also like, well, what's the difference? Well, 4,000 climate scientists tell us that to avoid catastrophic effects on the climate, the ecology of the climate and associated impacts on economic development, we've got to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius. So many argue that, okay, we don't want to compromise on that. Instead, we want to find innovations for achieving that goal. But others don't. They say, nope, that's just too difficult. We want to get to 3 degrees. And we need to go from there. That will change the way we think about the tools we apply to thinking about these problems. And that's why we think that path dependency analysis and policy design around triggering pathways consistent with the climate crisis that is diffuse is a way to anchor then whatever option is we ultimately try and achieve.
Okay, so the way you've answered that question, Ben, and some of the other questions that are coming in make me think of the concept of trade-off.
Right.
Because in the global climate situation, of course, you know, if we exceed a certain threshold, disastrous consequences. Until we get there, there are some observers who will say, yeah, but this is going to be really costly for industry. This is really costly for investment. And this is really costly for my poverty reduction programs. There's a trade-off that they're thinking about. So too in COVID-19. I mean, the trade-off there is, do I continue to lock down the economy, keep infection low, but at the same time suffer a reduction in the skills and the viability of my economic activity and business. So there's a trade-off there. How does that trade-off figure in your thinking about solutions to super wicked problems?
So we thought a lot about this question. How do we think about trade-offs themselves? And what we've done in our own work is we recognize that there are actually not one, but 4 ways to think of trade-offs.
4 ways?
4 ways, not one, but 4 ways in policy schools. So one way is made famous by Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winning economist. And her concern was, how do we make sure that societies don't overharvest a resource so they actually result in economically suboptimal outcomes? So this was a sustainability question, but it was around long-term management. And she discovered and won the Nobel Prize for finding a new solution. She abstracted around the problem, conceived of the problem, and realized that, oh, people before her hadn't seen it the way she did and offered a new solution that involved a lot more bottom-up approaches to solving this problem of collective action. We see, and so this is the trade-off there is that she's focused on how do we address one resource, like timber or fish. But whether that impacts, therefore, a community's ability to, let's say, convert forests to palm oil, that's not part of her equation. So her trade-off is how do we address the timber or the fish, not other problems. But then we find that what we call the economic optimization school that says, hang on, no, we care about overall economic utility, and this is a really important contribution of many economists, and therefore let's bring all these trade-offs in and analyze them against economic welfare generally. And this is an important service in which these trade-offs are internalized into an economic utility model that works very well. Sometimes, however, it goes to extremes. We had the example in Texas on COVID, of the lieutenant governor saying that he would prefer to die than to harm the economy and undermine utility for his grandchildren, right? So it can go too far sometimes. And so that trade-off, even there's limits to trade-offs in that kind of concept. Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale, Nordhaus, says that based on a discount rate that he applies to thinking about climate change, that the best we can do is 3.2 degrees using that trade-off model. Others say, no, we just compromise among utility with social concerns and environment, and we get a compromise approach that has trade-offs in that kind of context. What we're saying is, there's some problems that if you want to achieve them, you can't trade them off. You must have them addressed first and then address others. I want to give you one example just to reinforce the point that it isn't just in the environment. Think about the question of slavery. Okay, slavery is such a strong global norm, we'd never considered trading that off with another value. We wouldn't apply cost-benefit analysis to whether we should own slaves, or even a compromise approach about who gets to own slaves, because that would undermine the problem itself. So all we're saying is that some problems are so important they must first be addressed, and then others can be addressed after them. And so governments and society have a responsibility to decide which ones they want to be the ones you don't trade off from the ones you do.
Yeah, no, I fully subscribe to the idea that in certain circumstances, the trade-off frontier, as it were, is so steep or so flat, it doesn't actually make any sense to try to finesse that. But I suppose the difficulty is that in many problems, it's not always apparent that has to be the case. I mean, the examples that you and I have recited as well, carbon emissions. There was a time when carbon emissions did not have the disastrous image that they did. In fact, quite the opposite. They were viewed as a sign of progress. That's how you got your economy ahead. And as you yourself cited, that's how you ended up lifting hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty.
And compromise approaches themselves lead to legitimacy, they lead to trust, they lead to all kinds of positive benefits for society. So I'm not saying don't ever do compromise and don't ever do trade-offs involving economic welfare, not at all, just the opposite. What I am saying is that these questions of trade-offs are actually philosophies about how we see a problem, and they should be brought out first and adjudicated before doing a policy analysis or policy design.
Now the impact of the super wicked problem idea is magnified by the enormous challenges, real world challenges that you've described for us. There's kind of a question that says, can we think of examples of super wicked problems in the Ben Cashore sense that actually have been solved in a sensible way? They're actually out there. Someone has actually sort of, spontaneously or through some other mechanism, that we have hope that some of these super wicked problems can actually be managed in a spontaneous way, in an easier way.
Yeah. So that's a great question, because the last feature, as I've just pointed out, is that the policies discount the future irrationally. So if that problem is being solved, if we solve a super wicked problem, it loses its status, right? As well, right? So we have this kind of conundrum. How do we actually reduce the number of these kinds of problems? It's a great question. I would say the big ones are the ones that we tend to gravitate to that haven't been well addressed, and the climate crisis is one. But take COVID. A lot of countries gave it priority status. It gave it the equivalent of slavery, anti-slavery norms, and they said, no, we're going to address this crisis no matter what. We're going to use the best tools from economics, the best tools from stakeholder engagement, but we're going to do this in a way that maintains human lives above all else. And to me, you see some countries, including, again, we're very lucky to be in Singapore, where you see this actually happening. That to me would fit, that kind of model.
Let me press you on this, because this is going to be related to one of the questions that relates COVID with the global climate crisis. But before we get there, let me press you on this. The diversity of experiences, national experiences on COVID across the world is actually stark. We can say humanity recognizes the challenge, but how that has emerged in an outcome is actually has extremes. Like you say, we're lucky enough to live in Singapore, where the number of deaths per million people is about 4.9. China has number of deaths per million of about 3. New Zealand, about 5. The United States, 1,900. 1,900 deaths per million. The United Kingdom, the same. European Union, 1,000. So these are not just rounding error kind of differences. They're stark. So despite the enormity of the problem, does the super wicked mindset help me understand why different nations have responded so differently to the COVID crisis?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, let's take those two examples, Singapore and the United States, for example. I mean, the US has no semblance of a thermostatic institution when it comes to COVID management. In fact, you have the opposite. You have actually people arguing that their freedom depends upon not wearing masks and so on, which makes it very difficult to govern the United States in that context. You have in Singapore enforcement officers who actually help enforce the settings that have to be changed as we learn about more diseases. And I remember seeing a Facebook page in the United States saying, I wish we had that. Wouldn't that be great? An enforcement officer, right? That kind of institutional setting doesn't exist in the United States, but I would argue that the thermostatic properties in Singapore appear to be explain why it's doing so well and be able to get compliance. Now, why that emerges?
Yes.
Why that emerges? Of course, it's an abstract but also concrete question, right? Was it because of Singapore's previous experiences with previous pandemics?
Yeah.
Was it its cultural history? What was it? Our point is there's no one path to gaining a thermostatic status. But it seems from the evidence that we're experiencing that kind of mechanism, to me, explains why Singapore was able to have the kinds of effects that it did.
Yeah, it also points to how setting up these thermostatic institutions is an act of political will and trust in society. It's not something that you throw money at and solve, because obviously some of the richest countries in the world are the ones that have done the worst in this regard. Whereas not Singapore, but other poorer nations generally, Vietnam, Tajikistan, Thailand, have actually done relatively well on this front. It's not a question of throwing money at the problem. So the question that led me to asking about this was someone asking you to help them impress upon their national leaders. Once you've made the comparison between COVID and global climate, they say that COVID has grabbed the imagination and with an urgency that they wish they saw for the global climate challenge. What can we do to convey that to the global climate challenge itself?
Yeah, that's a really important question. In fact, I was, have the, I guess I would call it an honor to live here, to see this response in action in Singapore. And, immediately, in no time, we had these protocols in place, even in our university and US, immediately registering our temperature. And I was like, what's this? And we have to register our temperature as a way to the policy settings to try and immediately be part of this thermostat. So how do we then transfer to the climate crisis? Was the kind of point that I was trying to make at the end of my talk, that there are global reasons why thermostats on COVID ought to be built internationally, not just domestically, that would benefit domestic countries. And there's also, therefore, out of that, a recognition that we are part of a global community. And I think those norms around cooperation that might be sparked potentially from the COVID crisis in the future might diffuse to the climate crisis as well. I don't think there's many people arguing that the climate crisis isn't important. The vast majority of countries have signed on to the Paris Accord, and they've said 1.5 degrees. They've given it the prioritization status. This must be addressed. The issue is how. And to me, the design examples to me are where the action is at. And that's why I mentioned the German government's feed and tariff program. It's just one of 1,000 ideas out there. And I think we're leaving most of them uncovered, let alone pulled, by having these broader conversations that don't get into the nitty-gritty of settings and calibrations and thermostats.
I agree with you completely, Ben. I think that the consciousness of humanity across the world on global climate change is an order of magnitude, more aware now than it was, not that long ago. We've really sort of turned a corner on people knowing that there is such a problem. And of course, the mechanics of how we fix that remains ahead. But I do think we've turned the corner on that. And so this analogy that you've drawn between COVID and global climate crisis is one that I think is a really, really good and informative one. And Ben, and the way it helps illustrate the idea of super wicked problems is just wonderful. Many congratulations to you for that. We've reached the end of our time, and still got a whole bunch of questions, so I'm going to have to not give them to you, but rather, thank you so much, Ben, for spending this time with us, giving us such a wonderful lecture. I want to thank our audience for their attention and their participation. This has been an excellent time that we've had together. I hope that you will all attend many more such Lee Kuan Yew School events. I promise to once again use Ben Cashore to front such events, and we will get to have many such conversations in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, everyone.